Total shock. Zelensky made a move that set off all the red alerts in Moscow. The Kremlin suddenly found itself on high alert. The Moscow suburbs are burning, and now the Russian army is left deaf and blind. Decisive strikes that determined the further course of the war have already thundered. You won't believe it. Behind closed doors, Xi and Lukashenko decided Putin's fate. Beijing is joining forces with Minsk to finally spite Moscow. A real storm is approaching. A missile upgrade is on the horizon. Fedorov revealed the details of Ukraine's shocking agreements with France and the USA. A signal that the Kremlin will definitely hear. And all of this happened right now. Greetings. I'm Daryna Gutskalo, and we're getting started. At this very moment, Volodymyr Zelensky has terrified Moscow with an order regarding the Russian Federation. The Kremlin clearly did not expect such a turn of events. New signals from Kyiv have made the Russian leadership nervously look over their shoulders and prepare for more unpleasant surprises.
We are bringing the reality of war back to Russia and making it as difficult as possible for them to continue occupying our land.
The Russians barely had time to blink before the words of the Ukrainian leader began to be methodically put into action. Since last night, things have been heating up again in Russia's Moscow region. According to monitoring channels, the Dubna Space Communication Center has come under attack for the second time.
So what's happening on that side? Looks like something's burning. Take a look.
As we can see, the calm days for Russia's strategic facilities are truly over. Now the Russian army has been cut off from communications and is unable to control the satellite relays that the Russian Ministry of Defense uses for reconnaissance and troop coordination. And the capital itself is now officially gaining the status of a frontline city.
For the first time since the 1940s, war, with shelling and fires, has fully come to the Russian capital. The authorities turned out to be unprepared for war, and Muscovites were unprepared for the authorities' response.
The truth has finally come to light. Lukashenko has found himself a new protector. After his visit to Beijing, it seems the father received the main thing from Xi Jinping, a signal that Minsk can afford a bit more independence.
China supports Belarus in defending its national sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, as well as in pursuing a path of development that suits its national conditions, Xi Jinping stated. He also expressed China's readiness to continue supporting the development of Belarus in every possible way.
And now this looks like a very transparent hint to Moscow. For Belarus, the world does not end with Russia, and Putin's fate is beginning to directly depend on Lukashenko's actions.
For the Kremlin, this outcome of Lukashenko's visit to Beijing means a further increase in unpredictability in his behavior. And this unpredictability of Lukashenko in the context of Kyiv raising the stakes becomes especially dangerous.
Obviously, a new round of the game is beginning on the geopolitical chessboard, where Lukashenko may well rid himself of the yoke of vassalage, and China will take a step forward that will ultimately crush Russia under the weight of its political influence. Moreover, Beijing is persistently urging Moscow and Kyiv to resume negotiations to resolve the Ukrainian conflict.
We strongly urge an end to the conflict as soon as possible. We also strongly urge the resumption of negotiations, the demonstration of genuine political will, and doing everything possible to eliminate the root causes of this conflict through full and unconditional adherence to the principles of the UN Charter.
And yet another piece of evidence that even the most loyal allies are gradually tightening the vise around Moscow and behind closed doors are essentially deciding Putin's fate. The Kremlin should be on alert. After the talks between Zelensky and Macron, Ukraine is discussing with France a license to produce long-range Scalp missiles. Now Kyiv can not only receive its own weapons, but also gain the full right to manufacture them independently. This was reported by Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov.
These are the first steps. Careful. We continue to maintain these communications in order to achieve results. Actually, everything comes down to the details there. So for now, we are actively working on this.
The minister also reported that Ukraine is in talks with the United States regarding licenses for weapons production. Moreover, Ukraine is betting on its own long-range capabilities. In Kyiv, they openly say that the future of this direction depends primarily on Ukrainian manufacturers. That is why the state, together with its partners, is looking for new mechanisms to support the defense industry, including through the Danish model. Kyiv is preparing more actively to fight not only with Western weapons, but also with its own missile trump cards.
We understand how to scale what is already working effectively. and at this moment we are placing our greatest hopes and relying on our own capabilities in this regard. We are working to invest every additional dollar into Ukrainian production and to scale up this production. We are relying on our own capabilities in this regard.
You can't miss this. The Kremlin has been stabbed in the back by its own people. Veterans of the so-called special military operation are no longer staying silent and are openly challenging the system. What Putin feared most is beginning to take root right inside Russia. Calls to stop the war are now coming not from the opposition, but from those who until recently were considered the regime's backbone. Even the Z-patriots have started to express concern. Is a rebellion really brewing where the Kremlin once felt the safest? More on this coming up.
Urgent! It seems the Kremlin has once again sensed the scent of rebellion. While Putin tries to convince Russians that the situation is completely under control, voices of discontent are increasingly being heard within Russia itself, coming from the very circles that until recently were considered the regime's most reliable support. And if previously all threats to the Kremlin came from outside, now the most alarming signals are coming from within. Moscow still shudders at the memory of Prigozhin's march, and new statements and sentiments are forcing an uncomfortable question. Is a new wave of rebellion beginning to brew beneath the surface of the Russian system? And most importantly, does Putin today fear his own people much more than external enemies? All the explosive details are in the report. What the Kremlin feared after Prigozhin is resurfacing again. A Russian occupier recorded an address to Putin and threatened a scenario that Moscow would prefer to erase from its memory forever.
The army will turn its weapons against the Kremlin.
According to the occupier, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are allegedly being held in so-called dungeons, pits and improvised prisons, where they are thrown for refusing to carry out suicidal orders or for conflicts with the command. He claims that soldiers are punished, beaten, forced to hand over money, and the most undesirable are simply eliminated. And here arises a particularly uncomfortable question for the Kremlin. If all this is just the invention of one person, then why did millions of Russians watch the address in just a few days? And if even part of what was said is true, then we're talking about a much more serious problem, the accumulation of discontent within the army itself. Another telling point is this. Not so long ago, Russian propaganda was convincing society that the army and the authorities were a single unified monolith. But the longer the war drags on, the more often stories emerge about conflicts between soldiers and their commanders, about punishments, corruption, and mutual distrust. And although it's still too early to talk about any real mutiny, the very appearance of such statements is highly symptomatic. After all, the biggest problems for any government don't begin when it is criticized by its opponents. The most dangerous moment comes when uncomfortable questions start being asked by its own people. Those who just yesterday were called the main support of the state. It seems that the ghost of June 2023 still haunts the Kremlin offices. And every time words about weapons aimed at Moscow are heard from within the Russian military, the Kremlin involuntarily remembers how quickly confidence in total control can turn into a panicked search for answers. And here, it is worth recalling the words of Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president recently stated directly that Vladimir Putin is afraid not only of losing the war. What he fears most is his own army. According to Zelensky, this is precisely why the Kremlin is so desperately clinging to the continuation of the war. After all, the return of hundreds of thousands of soldiers home without a victory could create problems for the Russian authorities, problems they fear much more than sanctions or international isolation. And if you pay attention to recent events, these words no longer seem like just a simple political statement. First, there was Prigozhin's march on Moscow, which showed just how unexpectedly the usual mechanisms of control can fall apart. Now, new statements are emerging from soldiers who openly speak about discontent within the army and even mention the possibility of turning their weapons toward the Kremlin. And here, a particularly unpleasant dilemma arises for the Russian authorities. The longer the war drags on, the more people pass through the front lines, gain their own experience, and stop seeing reality only through television. And along with this, the number of those who start asking uncomfortable questions to the command and the country's leadership grows. Zelensky is convinced that Putin fully understands this threat. That is why, according to him, the Russian president is afraid of ending the war without a declared victory. After all, then they would have to explain to society what all those enormous losses were for, and to hundreds of thousands of soldiers why all the sacrifices did not bring the promised result. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about having full control over the situation, more and more signals indicate otherwise. The most dangerous challenges for the Kremlin may not come from abroad, but from within the system itself, from people who for years were called the main support of the Russian state. And while Russian military personnel openly threaten the Kremlin, other supporters of the war are already sounding the alarm over a completely different problem. It seems that more and more people inside Russia itself are becoming less concerned with victories at the front and more with what is happening in stores, at gas stations, and in their wallets. A particularly telling example was the statement by the well-known Z blogger Yevgeny Golman, a person who is certainly hard to suspect of sympathizing with Ukraine or criticizing the war. But this time even he couldn't hold back his emotions.
Let the President of the United States know, and let the Minister of National Defense know as well.
In his video, the propagandist essentially called on Russians to prepare for hard times. He advised people to stock up on non-perishable foods, to buy salt, canned goods, and even mentioned problems with fuel in the regions. It sounded as if the person addressing the public was not a supporter of the war, but someone preparing for serious economic turbulence. Not long ago, these very bloggers were assuring Russians that the economy had withstood the sanctions, industry was running at full capacity, and the country was successfully overcoming all difficulties. Now, however, these same people are suddenly advising to stock up on buckwheat, matches, and canned meat. And this looks like a very alarming symptom.
Rats, corporate office rats, just like the rest of you.
Moreover, in his emotional speech, Golman essentially accused the Russian elite of living in a separate reality. Supposedly, while ordinary people are being told to endure and donate money for the war, officials continue to feel completely comfortable and have no intention of giving up their usual way of life. The biggest problem for the Kremlin right now is not Ukrainian drones and not even the sanctions. The biggest problem is that more and more supporters of the system itself are starting to ask questions for which the authorities have no easy answers. And when even the most ardent supporters of the war advise stocking up on buckwheat and preparing for a difficult autumn, it already looks like a signal far more serious than any official reports about stability. Ukraine will storm the Kremlin? Zelensky's final order. Kyiv has given Putin only 40 days. The security service of Ukraine will not wait any longer. The end of the Russian Federation will be louder than ever before. The war has indeed entered its final stage. The Crimean inferno is burning even more fiercely. The strikes are becoming even more precise, and the main target, the Crimean bridge, is no longer so unattainable. Even Moscow has become a frontline city. Putin is simply unable to protect it. Are our forces really lying in wait around the corner from the Kremlin fortress? What will happen next? Let's watch. 40 days for the Kremlin. While Russian propaganda continues to talk about stability and control over the situation, soon Moscow will be ready for its last rites. In Kyiv, a plan has been approved that could seriously spoil the mood of many occupants of Kremlin offices. Volodymyr Zelensky announced the launch of a special 40-day operation aimed at influencing Russia, with the main goal of making the aggressor reconsider continuing the war. The most interesting part is that this is not about loud statements or diplomatic ultimatums. It's about the fact that in recent months, Russia has increasingly been experiencing strikes on military facilities, depots, logistics hubs, airfields, and enterprises that support the Russian war machine. And it seems that now they have decided to intensify this work even further. What's particularly noteworthy is that the new campaign is primarily based on the capabilities of the security service of Ukraine. According to Zelensky, SPU units have been demonstrating some of the best results on the front lines for several months now, thanks to the use of various types of drones. And the Alpha Special Operations Center is even considered one of the leaders in terms of the amount of Russian equipment and personnel destroyed. And while previously the Russian leadership could convince the population that the war was somewhere far away, now more and more Russian regions are regularly making the news due to explosions, drone attacks, fires at strategic sites, and transportation collapses at airports. It seems that Kyiv is increasingly shifting its focus from fighting for individual kilometers of the front to creating problems for the entire Russian military system. And if previously Moscow spoke about exhausting Ukraine, now they increasingly have to explain to their own citizens why yet another airfield, factory, or warehouse has once again become the center of an emergency situation. The number 40 days itself looks especially symbolic. In the Kremlin, they have probably already gotten used to counting missiles, drones, and sanctions, but now it seems they'll have to start counting days as well. Days during which Ukrainian special services plan to remind the Russian authorities of a simple fact: the longer the war lasts, the more costly it becomes for Russia itself. And if in recent months Moscow has already been forced to deploy air defense systems to the capital, redirect resources to protect the residents, and safeguard its most important facilities, then the main intrigue now lies elsewhere. How painful will the next 40 days prove to be for the Kremlin? And could this campaign become the final ironclad argument that continuing the war is becoming increasingly costly for Russia? And while the security service of Ukraine launches a new large-scale campaign to pressure Russia, the situation at the front is also getting worse and worse for the occupiers, especially in places where the Kremlin until recently felt almost completely safe, in Crimea. The peninsula, which Russian propaganda for years called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, is increasingly resembling a zone of total logistical disaster. The biggest hysteria in recent days has been stirred up by the Russian Z military bloggers themselves. The reason is quite telling. Ukrainian drones have started systematically hunting not only for depots, radars, or air defense systems, but also for the so-called mobile fire groups of the occupiers. These are the very same units that were supposed to protect Russian convoys and shield Crimea from air attacks. And here we ended up with an almost classic Russian story. The command decided to save their cargo by assigning armed escorts to guard them. But the opposite happened. If earlier Ukrainian operators had to search for valuable targets, now the Russians themselves started marking them. If you see a convoy with a mobile fire group, it means there's something important inside. Then the drones get to work. The scale of the problem can no longer be hidden, even by Russian propaganda. If at the beginning of the year the occupiers were losing about 4,000 vehicles per month, now the losses are already in the tens of thousands. In just the incomplete month of June, losses exceeded 10,000 pieces of equipment, and some days are setting new records. But the real nightmare for the occupiers begins near the Crimean coast. The Russians have deployed mobile fire groups along the coastline to shoot down Ukrainian drones. It would seem like a logical decision, if not for one problem. Now, Ukrainian naval drones themselves are going out to hunt these groups. As a result, the hunters are increasingly becoming the prey. In fact, Crimea has found itself caught between two fires. From the land, Ukrainian drones continue to methodically destroy the occupiers' logistics. From the sea, naval platforms and FPV drones are at work. And the Russian mobile groups, which were supposed to provide protection, are increasingly becoming just another entry in the casualty statistics. The most unpleasant thing for the Kremlin is that this no longer looks like isolated incidents. It resembles a systematic campaign. First, Ukrainian forces started knocking out radars and air defense systems, then they targeted logistics. Now it's the turn of the lowest tier of Russian air defense. And each new step makes life increasingly difficult for the entire group of occupiers on the peninsula. Meanwhile, near the Kerch Bridge, multi-kilometer traffic jams are being reported. According to satellite data, about 1,500 vehicles may have accumulated in the queue, and the column itself stretched for approximately 10 kilometers. In Russian social media groups, this is already being called an absolute record, something that supposedly has never happened before. But behind these emotional statements lies a rather simple reality. Traffic through the key artery of the occupied peninsula is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Against the backdrop of strikes on infrastructure and fuel shortages, any trip turns into hours-long waiting, and sometimes just an attempt to simply get off the peninsula. As a result, the Kerch Bridge increasingly looks less like a reliable corridor and more like a bottleneck where queues, frayed nerves, and the consequences of overall logistical instability accumulate. And in this picture, the peninsula itself is gradually shifting into a state of constant transportation pressure where even leaving becomes a challenge. Crimea, which for years was portrayed in Russian propaganda as a fortress of security, increasingly appears to be a region where logistics collide, pressure on the military system grows, and everyday tensions accumulate all at once. And while some are trying to patch up holes and shift resources around, others continue to methodically undermine the very foundation of this calm, making the situation for the occupiers not just difficult, but systemically unstable. A total turnaround in the Kremlin. Not long ago, they were promising to fight until a victorious end and issuing ultimatums, but now, suddenly, talk of negotiations is being heard more and more often. Against the backdrop of strikes on the Russian rear and problems that can no longer be concealed, Moscow's rhetoric is beginning to change sharply. Have Ukrainian actions really forced the Kremlin to reconsider its plans for victory and urgently look for an emergency exit from the war? Don't miss it. Something has clearly broken in the Kremlin. And so seriously, in fact, that the Russian leadership has suddenly started uttering a word that until recently was almost considered forbidden: negotiations. The very same negotiations that Moscow used to mention only in an ultimatum-like manner. But now the situation looks completely different. After a series of Ukrainian strikes that are reaching ever deeper into the Russian rear, Moscow has suddenly started talking about peace. And it's not just one person. Almost the entire Kremlin leadership has joined this marathon of peace-loving rhetoric in unison. The first to step into the arena was Putin himself. The man who for years assured Russians that everything was going according to plan suddenly declared his readiness for negotiations based on the Istanbul agreements. This refers to the draft agreement from the spring of 2022, which envisioned Ukraine effectively renouncing its bid to join NATO, enshrining neutral status in its constitution, and imposing serious restrictions on the Ukrainian army, from the size of its personnel to the number of weapons and missiles. In addition, the document stipulated a ban on the deployment of foreign military bases and contingents on Ukrainian territory, while the issues of Crimea and Donbass were essentially set aside or postponed for years. In other words, today Putin is proposing not just to return to some abstract negotiations, but to a project that was being developed back when the Kremlin was convinced it could dictate its terms to Kyiv from a position of strength. It's absurd that Russia has been waging war for the 4th year now, yet as the basis for peace, it once again pulls out a document from the first weeks of the invasion as if nothing has changed since then. It's as if they pulled it out of an old drawer, dusted it off, and solemnly presented it as the foundation for peace. It looks as if the Kremlin suddenly decided to reread its own archives in search of at least some way out of a situation that increasingly resembles a dead end. And that's when things got really interesting. Almost simultaneously with Putin, Lavrov started talking about negotiations, then Ushakov, then Bortnikov. It gives the impression that an urgent memo was sent out in Moscow with a single phrase, "Immediately talk about peace." Otherwise, it's simply impossible to explain such astonishing unanimity. The speech by FSB head Bortnikov looks especially comical, considering that his agency had for years falsely labeled Zelensky a terrorist. But now it turns out that they'll somehow have to talk to this terrorist. Moreover, according to the FSB director, there simply isn't any other interlocutor in Ukraine. It turns out to be rather awkward to spend years telling Russians that they're facing nothing less than humanity's main enemy, and then just shrug and say, well, in the end, we'll have to talk to him. This story looks even more interesting against the backdrop of Putin's own past statements. In 2004, he solemnly declared that Russia does not negotiate with terrorists but destroys them. More than 2 decades have passed, and now the very person who once made these loud proclamations is essentially proposing negotiations with someone whom his own propaganda calls a terrorist. As they say, life is the best writer of political satire. And all this is happening not against the backdrop of Russian victories as the propaganda tries to convince us. On the contrary, Russian regions are waking up to explosions more and more often. Airports are shutting down operations and the authorities are nervously counting the losses. The war that the Kremlin once promised to keep far from Russian cities is increasingly coming home. That is why statements about negotiations sound especially telling. After all, just a few months ago, Russian TV studios were packed with experts promising a decisive victory, the defeat of Ukraine, and even a march on Kyiv. And now, instead of more threats, we are witnessing a remarkable transformation. The very same people are now all explaining together that negotiations are very important, very appropriate, and in fact long overdue. And that's not all. Amazingly, Putin is now keeping away from scandals. Not long ago, Russian propaganda could have blown Belarus's ultimatum up to the scale of an international crisis, but this time everything sounded surprisingly subdued. In Moscow, they essentially made it clear that this is an internal matter for Minsk and that Russia supposedly would only help its ally if necessary. No stern statements, no threats to Zelensky, no show of belligerence. The Kremlin, which for years tried to present itself as the center of power for the entire post-Soviet space, is now increasingly forced to economize even on loud political scandals. In Moscow today, they are much more concerned with their own problems and searching for a negotiated way out of the war than with staging yet another geopolitical spectacle around their allies. The reaction to the recent strikes on Crimea and Russian regions is a separate story altogether. Not long ago, after every such attack, Moscow would hint at terrible retaliation, nuclear strikes, and other apocalyptic scenarios. But this time, nothing of the sort happened. None of the promised escalation, no day of revenge, no nuclear blackmail that the most ardent supporters of Kremlin rhetoric were counting on. Instead, negotiations, and more negotiations. And here, the situation becomes even worse for the Kremlin. According to reports from Western media, there is increasing talk in Washington about the need to put more pressure on Moscow. And in Kyiv, they are talking about having received an effective carte blanche from the US to strike targets on Russian territory. The Russian leadership understands perfectly well that the more opportunities Ukraine has to strike at Russia's military infrastructure, the harder it will be to convince the population that the war is going well. That is why today's wave of peace-loving statements looks less like a show of strength and more like a warning signal. The Kremlin can repeat its mantras about confident advances and complete control over the situation as much as it wants, but the facts speak for themselves. If everything is really going so well, then why has the entire Russian leadership suddenly rushed to find a negotiation platform? It seems the answer is quite simple. The war that Moscow planned to finish in a matter of weeks has turned into years of exhaustion. Reserves are dwindling, problems are piling up, strikes on the rear are becoming increasingly painful, and most importantly, it is getting harder and harder to explain to Russians why, after all the promises of a quick victory, the Kremlin has suddenly started talking so insistently about peace. And the louder the calls for negotiations coming from Moscow today, the stronger the sense that it is no longer Ukraine looking for a way to end the war. It is the Kremlin that is increasingly seeking a way out without admitting its own defeat. With that, we conclude our broadcast. We continue to closely follow the most relevant events right now so we can be the first to tell you about them. Don't forget to subscribe. See you!